welcome to the Oral History Project, Oral History of Criminology Project. We are here today in Philadelphia at the annual meeting of the American Society of Criminology. My name's Natasha and I'm here interviewing Todd Clear about his life and distinguished career in criminology and particularly in corrections. I'll give a little bit of a background of Todd before we get started. Today, Todd received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Division on Corrections and Sentencing, so that it probably sets the stage to let everyone know that Todd is one of the most distinguished scholars of corrections that our field has ever known. He has a degree, a PhD in criminal justice from SUNY Albany at some point in the 70s, I'll just say it that way. And he's had major academic appointments at Florida State University, where he was Associate Dean, at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where he was a distinguished professor and also the executive officer of the doctoral program. From there, he was at Rutgers in between. From there, he went back to Rutgers as initially as the dean of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice there, and then ultimately as provost of Rutgers University in Newark. And most recently is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University, and currently on a leave, enjoying himself in Montana. So I will start with, he's also, I should add, he also has been the president of both ASC and the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. He served as vice president of ASC. He's always been very active in the Division on Corrections and Sentencing, and has won major awards from both of our major societies. So obviously from this litany of awards and appointments, he's clearly one of the most well-known criminologists still living today. And so I thought I would open by asking Todd if he could give us a little bit of a history of your life before you went into academia. And you were quite young, so when you were in your diapers. What did you do before criminology?
So I went to college in Anderson, Indiana. It's now called Anderson University. They give a master's degree, I think, in theology or something. And I went there because it was free. My dad was a professor there, and because like most people who are graduating from high school, I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do, and there was no choice box available to say take a couple of years off, live at home, and mom will still cook for you.
No gap year.
There was no gap year. And my first year there, I lived on campus and did very well academically. And my second year there, my parents left the country and I stayed in the house, a block away from the campus, and we literally destroyed the house. I remember, I think I got one C and everything else was an F, was kicked out of school, but I had literally the most wonderful year a young man can have, doing all the things that people did in the 60s. What came out of that was giving up a musician's career. I was a musician at the time, but I also, that year, my son was born, my first child was born, and sort of the reality of what was going on hit me, and I realized I think this idea that I had that I was going to be, a rock and roll star was not in the cards, or not in the fingers, I should say, and I went back to school and got serious about my studies, and and ended up graduating as a social work major from Anderson College, and it is the one place I don't give any money to, because any place that would let a person like me graduate doesn't deserve an investment.
Not be invested in. And then did you go directly into your graduate studies? Or?
I did. What happened was I was a social work major, and I didn't make it to graduate. You had to do a placement in your senior year. I didn't make it to the office that handed out the placements on time. Why are we laughing? And there was only one left at the Indiana State Reformatory, and so it was either take that placement or delay graduating. So I took the placement. I didn't have any plan at all to be in the field of criminal justice. I was interested in regular traditional social work applications for families and so on. But I took that placement, and I had this idea that I was going to, I had hair down past my shoulders, and I was, it was the 60s, and I was in favor of the revolution, whatever that was. And I literally thought I was going to walk into the prison, Pendleton State Reformatory, built at the turn of the century, traditional prison with guard turrets and big thick walls. I thought I was going to walk in, and there were going to be a bunch of men with pickaxes in the middle, you know, doing whatever they do, and I was going to stand at the top of the steps and stick my fist in the air and say, "All power to the people," and they were going to turn around, and in one voice they would say, "All power to the people," and somehow this, you know, revolutionary moment was going to happen, and that wasn't what happened at all. I was scared the entire time I was in the prison. That first day, I was heckled because of my hair. I was pinched a couple of times. The COs chuckled at a guy like me being in prison, and I left terrified to come back again. But somehow in that moment, I knew that I had discovered this world that I didn't have any idea existed, that I needed to know more about, to find out more about. And so I had plans to go to graduate school in social work. I changed them and applied to graduate schools in criminal justice. Albany had just opened its doors. I got accepted and got some money. I think I got $1,400 stipend or something like that to go. And boom, off the way.
And I know, and I think it's an interesting part of your story is that your trajectory is quite different from that of the rest of your family. Yeah. So I wondered if you give a little background of your dad and your brothers.
So my father's a sociologist.
Was a sociologist. I had a degree, a PhD in sociology from University of Chicago. His professors included Thrasher, McKay, and Sutherland. He wrote a dissertation actually on religious movements, not on which is coming out of the field of deviance in sociology at the time, but his main mentors were all people who made extraordinary contributions in the area of criminology. And he became a minister, was ordained, and came back to Anderson College as his ministry to be a sociology professor there. Started a sociology department and also a social work major. And in my family, all my brothers, all my uncles, most of my cousins, my grandfather, and and I think just about everybody in 3 generations is an ordained minister, not me.
Right, right.
But I have always been drawn to, I think, the part of the teachings that were common in my family, which were about service, about social justice, and about understanding the human condition, particularly and certainly forgiveness. And and so those kinds of values, even though I didn't pick up the theology side, I think I picked up the social justice side, those core values.
Right. And then so when you entered the field, or first were entering the field of criminology, having coming out of social work, who were your major influences if you worked on, I know you went straight into a PhD program, so in your PhD, in your early years, who influenced you the most? Who was your mentor?
The person who supervised me through
my dissertation, also gave me my first job in graduate school, and became my surrogate father, was Vince O'Leary. Vince O'Leary at the time was a professor at Albany. He later became dean and then later became president at Albany. He did not have a PhD. He had a master's degree in psychology and never finished a PhD. And Vince was deeply engaged in the field of corrections. The other Vince story I'll say is that he was a professor in a class that I took in my first semester. And this was sort of the sorting out class that graduate students there had. And they gave a paper assignment in September that was due the first week of October, and then you got your first grade back in graduate school. And it was what we call a position paper. It was where you write in response to a question. So that was the first paper. There were 25 of us in the class, I think. And when they handed the paper back, they put the array of grades on the board. You know, there was 1 A+, exceptional paper. They went through, 4 A's, 2 B+, or whatever, 3 C's. This is a failing grade in graduate school. I didn't know that. I thought, a C was a C. And 1 F. And they said, if you got a C, you should ask yourself, what you can do to improve it. If you got the F, you should ask yourself if you belong here. And I got paper back, and I looked and I thought, I just assumed I had the A+.
Right.
That's what happens to me. And I opened it up and I had the F. And I couldn't believe it. So I went home and talked to my wife, and we decided, that graduate school wasn't for me, and we'd go back to Indiana. And next day I went in and I was packing up my stuff from my cubicle, and Vince saw me. Vince was one of the professors of the class, and it was a team talk class. And he saw me walking out with my stuff, and he said, "Todd, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I don't, I'm just going to go home. I'm going to drop out on a blog here." And he called me into the office, and he asked me what I did to work on the paper. He asked me things like, "Did I proofread it?"
Did you ever look at it?
Tell me how you approached going into the library. Library? And basically, I didn't know anything at all about how to write a terminal, how to do an academic paper. And he said, you belong here. You just have to decide if you're going to do it here, if you're going to work hard enough to stay here. And he put me in touch with a guy named Bill Firearm, who was a class ahead of me, to be a mentor, a student mentor. And I stayed in. And I ended up getting an A in that class. I did those funny things. I proofread the paper, I went to the library, I did kinds of weird things.
Weird stuff.
That weird stuff that sometimes happens. And I think I learned two things from that. One is that while having, intelligence matters, and really working harder is worth 10 points for every 1 point you get for being smart. No, I know a lot of smart people who never finished a dissertation. I know a lot of smart people who can't get their papers published. Working hard, nothing replaces working hard. And the second thing I learned is I couldn't do it all by myself. I needed someone to show me things and to help me with things. And so I learned, the value of help. And when I graduated, Vince was president at the time, I said, I went up to him, I'm all emotional, I'm getting a PhD, he's going to owe me. And I asked him how I can pay him back, and I thought he was going to say, well, whatever. But he said, you can't pay me back. There's no way you can pay me back. He said, just when the opportunity comes to do this with somebody else, that's what you do. Right. That's how it works in this business. And that has always felt to me to be true. Right. And I don't have I don't have Vince's charisma, I don't think, but I do believe that if you have been given something, it's because someone else was given something, and now you have to give it.
Give it,
so,
pay it forward, so to speak. Right. And I know you went to Albany at a time that a lot of our senior scholars in the field were at Albany or shortly before or after you. So who are some of the most memorable other criminologists that were your cohort?
So I think
I started before and finished after a lot of very famous criminologists. Michael Goffredson, Rob Sampson, I'm missing a bunch of them.
Donna Bishop.
Donna Bishop was there, yes. I think at one time, Albany had like 2/3 of the board members of ASC as graduates. In those days, there weren't very many Albanys, and it was the place. And there were sociology programs had criminologists, but really Albany was defining criminal justice. There were some really talented people there, and I think we learned the value of interdisciplinary study, and that that this was not an area of sociology, even though a lot of people think it is. That you can have a lot of different perspectives and make a real contribution in the field of criminal justice.
So I wanted to turn a little bit to your scholarship and your focus in your career. And so it's pretty fair to say you've spent your entire career in corrections for the most, but your interests in corrections have really moved and changed over the years. So I wonder if you give us a little history of your intellectual development in the area of corrections.
Well, my first mentor was Vincent O'Leary, like I said, and Vince was the first, was a chief probation officer in the state of Washington and created, state parole officer in the state of Washington, and created the parole system in Texas. And he was, very mindful of post-prison supervision issues. Excuse me. And he was asked by Lyndon Johnson to head the corrections task force of the Presidential Crime Commission that Johnson did, and that's how I got involved in academia. He headed up that task force. And I saw him do this work in parole, and I wanted to do a similar kind of thing in probation. I wanted to think about how probation ought to work and how probation officers work with people on probation. We had a small project in the Bronx in New York. Like I said, I had spent my entire life in Indiana, and the first time I went to New York to do this work, and this field work was like, I got lost 27 times and scared 40 times and all that. The South Bronx, there was a movie back in the 70s called Fort Apache that was sort of a that was filmed in that part of the South Bronx where I did my doctoral work with probation officers. And then we ended up adding a project in upstate New York, and then a project outside of Boston. And I studied probation officer decision making about cases, and wrote a dissertation on how probation officers establish the supervision objectives for clients and what those objectives are. But what I really did was to get immersed in the world of probation, the thinking of probation officers, the sort of dynamics of a probation office, the formal and informal philosophy of probation work, and loved it. At the same time, in '72, the Nixon Commission did its report, which was Criminal Justice Standards and Goals. A lot of people don't even know about those anymore, but following the Johnson Commission, Crime Commission, on law enforcement and the administration of justice, there was a Nixon Commission, because Nixon had declared war on crime. There was a Nixon Commission to make the criminal justice system work. And one of the things that commission had was a series of conclusions about the prison system, that prison, this is right after Attica as well, that prisons didn't work, they were counterproductive, that this idea, reintegration, was really the right idea, and not rehabilitation, and not punishment, but reintegration, which means when a person is convicted of a crime, you want to begin right away figuring out how they can adjust to become positive citizens in society. So a bunch of us in graduate school knew that we were going to be closing prisons all over the U.S. So we formed a group called the Center for the Abolition of Prisons, CAP, and we had business cards made, letterhead. We were going to make our livings helping local and state governments figure out what to do with all these people convicted of crimes because they didn't have prisons or jails. We closed that business down. It didn't do that well. But I became interested in alternatives to incarceration then. Coming out of my initial interest in prisons had been to run prisons. And the Attica, my first month in graduate school, Attica happened. And sort of stemming from the research, the report of Attica, the stories about Attica, the understanding of the prison, relationship of prison to public policy that came out of the rebellions that happened then, it became clear to me that prisons were not the place to make an investment in the criminal justice system. Elsewhere it was, and so I got interested in probation as an alternative to incarceration. And I did that work for, so that was 72 was the last year that the prison system actually, 71 was the last year it dropped in relation to the previous year. 72 it grew, and it grew every year from 72 on. And that whole time that the prison system was growing between 5 and 8% a year, I was an advocate for alternatives to incarceration, and it was an uphill battle. It was not a tailwind at all for that work. And the initial work that I did, Vince and I wrote a book called Controlling the Offender in the Community. The book was really about management, about organizational structures and supervisory probation officer relationships, and a lot of sort of inside baseball kind of ideas about probation, most of which are now common ways of doing business, risk assessment, needs assessment, so on. But I thought, I want to make this relevant to the 70s, and Vince is, he's an old guy, he's not really relevant, so what people think of me now, And so I said, we're gonna name it Controlling the Offender in the Community. And I think because I actually still believe very much in the idea of control, but I thought we were gonna develop this philosophy of incapacitation as a community-based idea, and coming out of that work, I spent a lot of time with the National Institute of Corrections on the Model Probation Parole Management Project, Case Management Project, and Chris Baird ran when he was there, and I think I must have visited 40 of the 50 U.S. states, had training programs that did all this work, and everything we did to try to strengthen probation didn't matter. The prison system grew, laws were passed a little more harsh, money was cut from probation budgets, the prison side of the corrections budget grew, and in 1990, I took my first sabbatical and went to England, exhausted. I want to say physically, because I'd done a lot of traveling and so on, but I think really spiritually exhausted. And somehow this book, Harm in American Penology, came out. I wanted to call the book Penal Harm until somebody pointed out that probably would have been a bad idea. But in the book, I developed this argument about this concept of hurting people through the penal system as a way of making things better, and how counterproductive that was, and so on. But the book itself was a watershed for me, because I stopped worrying about trying to compete with the prison system and do something in corrections that would be more attractive than prisons, and started thinking about replacing the prison system with something that's different, and got interested in community justice and wrote a series of books about community justice. And really left the national going to places and consulting with probation departments, corrections departments about implementing systems, left that line of work, and started working with reformers, people who were interested in changing the system, and met a whole different crew of people. Now they overlap a bit, yeah. And so many of them know each other, and then so that would have been like sort of intellectual phase 2. I still believe very much in the philosophy of community justice. I believe that it is the answer to the question, what is the justice system about? But what happened was, at the same time, a lot of communitarian ideas were developing, and a lot of community-based other kinds of things were going on. So there was this symmetry there. And then when I was at Florida State, Dina Rose and I started studying the impact of high rates of incarceration on communities, coming out of this idea that the purpose of the justice system is to make communities better places to live. If the justice system is actually damaging those communities, then the justice system is the problem rather than the solution for those communities. And we studied Tallahassee. We found very strong empirical evidence that the high concentration of incarceration was damaging those neighborhoods, and wrote a piece that was published in Criminology, a theoretical. And then coming out of that, I wrote Imprisoning Communities, which was this flow from a Get Tough movement to its impact on communities, to the recognition that this is a dead-end street. And then sort of the trilogy, so Controlling the Offender Community, Punishing Communities, and then the book that you and I wrote. I think it's sort of those three go together. And now most of my work is on practical strategies for reducing the number of people in prison.
And so of that huge body of work, is there one piece of which you're most proud, or that you feel like really is Todd clear? I mean, I think Harm was like a really changing moment for you. but is there?
Yeah.
I mean, they all have impacts in their own ways, so it might be hard to single out one.
So I quite like imprisoning communities. I think that I had the most emotion writing the Harm book, because I think I made a realignment from being aligned to the system trying to do things to being aligned to the person to whom things are being done. And all the work since then has been from the point of view of the person rather than the system. So I think that was important. I'm also quite proud, ironically, of a project that Rutgers got involved in when I was dean, providing college courses for people in prison. It's a consortium of New Jersey higher education institutions. It currently has about 600 students taking classes in the prison system. It gives 100 AA degrees and about 25 BA degrees every year. It admits somewhere between 20 and 30 students to Rutgers when they're released from prison every year. They study Rutgers. When Obama came to Newark in his last year of the presidency, he met with our students on campus. When he gave his commencement address at Rutgers in the main campus, there were 10 students in the audience who were graduating, who took their first college course in prison. So, I'm deeply proud of that work because, the books are things that people read, but this is changes in lives that has a ripple effect, children, families, communities, and so on. And while I don't think college education is the answer to the problem of mass incarceration, being involved in college education for people in prisons is the answer to how can a person be relevant to a mass incarceration problem who works in universities.
That's a good one. I also wanted to ask, kind of relatedly, why do you think your work has had such an impact among other scholars? I mean, you've mentored many students, obviously, but even outside of those you've mentored, you're one of the most heavily cited criminologists. Your work is just constantly referred to in other people's work, and so clearly has had a major impact in how we think about correction. So is there a quality of your work that you would say gives it that broad appeal? And I could answer the question, but is there a...
Interested to what you think, because I don't know that I have an answer. I mean, I feel really lucky that I've been able to write about things I care about. And the care is not, I care about the quality of the work, of course I care about that, but I care about the content of the work.
So I can end. I mean, one of the things that I would say has made a huge difference in the way people, so when I teach and some of my students now teach, you wrote, I believe it's actually an intro to somebody else's book, where you wrote a little italicized extract about truth in sentencing, right? And so it's a story where you're the judge, giving a sentence to someone and telling the truth of that sentence. And that, I open my classes with that, and it immediately changes how people think about the system. And especially truth in sentencing, which most people want to believe in, right? That there should be truth in sentences, and you should serve what you were sentenced to. And then you read that truth in sentencing where you argue, if the judge really said what the truth of the sentence was, that you're being sentenced because you're a young black male in a community, and I could almost cite it by memory, but I really do think that the quality of your work that it affects people is your ability to tell a story in a way that a scholar of criminology can easily relate to, but also people who have never touched the system can read and understand and I don't know that many criminologists or many scholars more generally in the world have that ability to speak in a way that can really appeal to broad audiences and tell a story in a compelling way. So you often do it. I don't know how much you recognize how much you do it, but you start with a way of telling, just like that, an extract that will sort of make a hard point and then use that as a jumping off point for developing.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I remember when I had that idea of, it was 94 and
the sentencing movement was going on in Clinton, and I was so angry about it because it was, and everybody loved truth in sentencing. How can you be against the truth? And although we live in a time now when the truth has a certain different meaning, doesn't it? But and I just kept thinking, but that's not the truth about this sentence. The sentence is, going to do nothing, not going to accomplish anything, going to cost a lot of money. I'm doing it because I don't have other choice. You know, that's the truth, the real truth. And I was giving a talk actually at the American Probation and Parole Association, and when I had that idea. So I think that's interesting that you say that. You know, Vince O'Leary taught me not to write jargon. Like I don't like to go to sessions where the word carceral is in the title.
Me either.
You know, I mean, I suppose it's a perfectly good word, but it's like our word. You know, it's not like a word that you're not gonna see. You know, some woman on her way to work in an office turn on the radio and say, "Oh, good, they're talking about carceral America. I want to hear that." You know, like if you want to talk to people, use plain language. Like the word utilize, almost always replaceable with the word use. And
one of the first things you taught me.
Utilize may sound like you're doing some magical thing. I'm utilizing this phone to text my daughter. No, you're using it. Why not use the word? Persons is another word. You know, persons go to school. No, people go to school. You know, a person. You know. Anyway, so and Vince O'Leary, one time I gave him literally 180 pages, double-spaced typed up of a report. He gave me back 20. I don't know what happened to the other 60. It was golden. I can tell you it was golden. But what he did was he said, you know, you don't have to use a lot of words to say something, and just say it. You know, don't. And so I think often in this field, we think we want to impress somebody, some scholar, and I know this is a cliche to say this, but I think there's truth to it, with words that convey deeper meaning than they actually have. And the depth of this work that we do is good enough on its own terms. You know, prisons are prisons. They're not carceral social somethings. You know, in the last 2 years, I've tried to excise the word prisoner and offender from my language. I still sometimes use it, and in writing, sometimes you can't avoid it. But in the textbook, this new edition of the textbook, I don't think the word prisoner is in there. I don't think the word probationer is in there. I don't think the word offender is in there. I mean, I think offender is in there around titles like sex offender as a category. But because these are people. You know, and there are people in prison. There are people on probation. You know, and so language matters. And so when you use language that tells a story that people can visualize, you know, they hear themselves in it. But if you use the language that we in this field often like to congratulate ourselves with, I don't mean to put it down so much because it's not really fair. But it is. There's this way in which we create our own language and then we insulate ourselves from the meaning that the world has.
Right. The other thing that you do a lot in the way you write, which I think is the other broad appeal of your scholarship, is you always have, where you raise a problem, you offer a solution. I think that is probably another defining characteristic. And the way in which you do it is different than some other scholars would do, in that you give real practical, it's clear your experience on the ground, working with probation officers, working with departments of correction, shows in that you make real practical solutions to things. You don't say, you don't make a long-winded 50-page, you know, here's what you need to do. You say, you need to do 3 things. Stop sending people to prison, don't keep them there as long, let them out early. Like, and it's always just things that, you know, people can spend a long time, and really that's the point, right? But they can not get to the point even after writing 50 pages. So I think that's the other thing that you've done really well is communicate an answer where you see a problem rather than just identify problems all over the place.
So I appreciate that you say that, because I think that, you know, having been a university administrator and a dean and a program director, you know, I think people who are critical of what's going on are a dime a dozen. And, you know, again, I don't want to be overly state this, but it was actually Jeremy Travis who taught me this lesson. He came to be president at John Jay, and I was director of the doctoral program, and he said, I want to have a report on the doctoral program and a one-on-one. We'd known each other for years, and I went in with him, and I went in with a list of all the problems, and we talked for an hour. So Todd, this has been very helpful background. He said, but I want you and I to have an agreement that when you meet with me, you don't bring me a problem unless you also are suggesting a solution. And it was like, But she doesn't, like, I don't want to just hear problems.
Right.
There are problems. I'll tell you my problem. What should we start talking about? Of course there are problems. But, in this world, there's a problem that doesn't have a solution. It's not worth really talking about, particularly. And there's no insight to doing it. So there is mass incarceration. It is a terrible problem. So let's talk about what we're going to do to resolve it. And I mean not, structural racism. It's also a problem. But if you were to say we're going to solve mass incarceration by ending structural racism, I want to say, I'm 68. I'm not going to be around. But I can think of solutions that that if you implement them now, before I celebrate my 70th birthday, we'll have way less incarceration. Those are the solutions I'm interested in.
Right. And I think that is the key to your suggestions. They're not, 100 years from now we might realize change, right? But that we could have an impact today. And that's so I wonder, as a scholar, and I think of the younger generation of scholars, and are kind of lucky in that they're not living in a time where it feels fairly hopeless, right? And that we are seeing shifts in the way people think about incarceration. But I wonder, over the span of a 40-year career, what are some of the major changes? When someone looking back 100 years from now, watching this video, how has corrections changed over your career? Positive ways, negative ways?
So that's a great.
So one of the things about American corrections is that it's really hundreds of different things. So there's 50 states, and there's 3,000 counties, or plus almost 4,000 counties. So and everyone has its own correction system. There are cities with correction systems and so on, federal. And so if you want to make a point, there's something out there where you can make that point. There's a story out there that will make that point. So, but by and large, during my career from the 70s on, early on in that time period, police started to become more professional in how they did their work. They started looking at evidence about policing. They started confronting difficult evidence, studies that turned out bad, they ended up having to deal with, response time studies and police deployment studies and all that stuff. Corrections was late to come to that party. There was a lot of bad news for corrections, and we just sort of said, from after the rehabilitation is dead era, we stopped thinking about things. And that has changed. I think there are now lots of really thoughtful and self-critical professionals in the business. We were talking about this earlier today. I think there's a worker problem. Workers are used up. Probation, parole officers, corrections officers, they get brought in, they get sucked dry, and then they are sort of they get spit out. And so I think that's a key problem. But leadership in corrections is by and large thoughtful, by and large progressive, by and large responsive to meaningful evidence, and that is different. And the other thing is, I think, so I wrote this piece, something like, the title was something like, How Incarceration Causes Crime, or something like this. This was back in the 80s. This was just when I was beginning to get out of the, make probation better business and into the community justice business. I couldn't get it published. And some guy, I was doing the talk in, I don't know, Oklahoma or something, and some guy came up to me and said, "Can I publish this in my journal?" "What's your journal?" "It is the Oklahoma Department of Corrections Journal of Research." It had like 2 issues or something. I said, "Sure, you can have it." And for the longest time, if you Googled me, or, that was the first thing that came up. It became this sort of thing that people sent each other in the field, right? So I'm sure you don't subscribe to the Oklahoma Department of Corrections Research Journal, neither do I. But this particular article,
Backfired.
Backfire, that's what it was. Yeah, thanks. That got sent around.
Yeah.
And the reason was that people in the system knew that what they were doing made no sense. It was counterproductive. It was nasty. It was illogical, and they would never wish to do more of it. And yet, everybody else was wanting to do more of it. So what's happened has been the field, I think, has matured, and and I think evidence has started to matter. Although I sometimes, when I was president, I gave a presidential address to sort of attack the evidence-based movement.
Yeah.
So and I think that's been another quality of my work, which is I'm as you know probably as well or better than anyone. I like to be a little irreverent, and if too many people like an idea,
you'll find a way to not like it.
I'm more inclined to then, therefore, as a consequence, dislike it.
Right. And actually, I'd like to turn to that, because I think that was, even now, we're in the evidence-based era of corrections, of policing, of all of our criminological fields for the most part. And so that, I think that critique that you gave in your, when you were president of the American Society of Criminology as your address, ruffled feathers a little bit, right? And some of the biggest names in the field were probably a little offended by what you said. And I guess I wanted to ask why you felt compelled in that moment, or what was your argument that sort of summarize it for the future generations about what is the problem with the evidence-based paradigm?
So let me begin by saying that I really truly do believe in evidence. Right? But it's sort of like the same problem with truth in sentencing. I believe in truth.
Yeah.
You know, but it's so bounded at the sentencing, at the moment of sentencing. It's so bounded, and the evidence-based movement for many people is defined as controlled experiments in the field. And now, I sent a draft of that to David Weisberg, who's a colleague and a good friend, and also to Larry Sherman. They're both evidence guys. You know, they're both experimental guys, and they each had a critique of it before I gave it, and I appreciated their critique. But David's critique was really interesting. He said, this is a version of the evidence-based movement that you're critiquing, and I agree with your critique, but that's not really what evidence is. And and Sherman said the same kind of thing. There's lots of evidence taught out, and evidence is not just an experiment. But I think in the Justice Department, evidence was defined as a controlled, randomized trial.
Right.
And I think there's still a lot of impetus for that model. And what's wrong with that is that it doesn't leave much room for a harebrained idea that teaches you something you didn't even expect to learn. You design an experiment to learn a particular thing about a particular thing, and it is the best way to learn that thing about that thing. But that's not going to get us very far in a field that is so distorted as the mass incarceration behemoth that we have in the criminal justice system. And I'm wanting to see new ideas, not just proven ideas.
Right.
And so that was essentially that critique.
So you want people to be experimental in other ways, not just experimental methods.
So let's ask ourselves very fundamental questions about values, and you can't really test them with experiments. And when I was giving that address, I was making eye contact regularly with David and Larry, and I remember giving that address and thinking, they're still sitting there. Okay, they're still sitting there. I have great admiration for both of them and for the work they've done and their contributions. They're extraordinary scholars and very important. But we're supposed to be a little uneasy with ourselves all the time. We're supposed to be a little bit self-doubting, a little bit critical of our own work. If we never are that, then we're going to really miss the biggest opportunity we have, which is to grow. To change, to become the new scholar that we're really needing to be.
Right. And that's actually the perfect segue to talk a little bit about your mentoring philosophy. So I obviously benefited immensely from your mentoring. I think someone told me yesterday that when you Google me, you actually come up as like the third or fourth thing after me. So clearly we are connected, we've written together and so on and so forth. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your mentoring philosophy. I know you mentioned it earlier with Vincent O'Leary and the idea of paying it forward. But how do you pick your students? How do you mentor students best?
I think students have
picked me. I haven't picked them. So you're in a whole different category. You should know that. You know how there's this joke about so and so completes my sentences. Well, that was always been true working with you.
Right.
Everything that
we
worked on. Yeah. So and oftentimes I was always marveling about how you would know the thing I wouldn't remember to do or couldn't think to do or would do wrong, and you would fix it before we had too much trouble. So one of the things of working with you as a student was really we became colleagues very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually the whole point. I felt like I was Vince's teammate. Now, Vince clearly knew what he was doing more than me. He was clearly, when we went into a meeting, he was the leader. The first time he had me make a presentation, he was very nervous. He wasn't sure I was going to be able to pull it off. I don't even know if I did or not. But he didn't believe in I was working for him.
Right.
We were working together, and there were just different skill and experience sets. But he always wanted to know what I thought, and I always felt like I was being stretched to actually have a thought. You know, I guess I think this. And I think I learned that I don't want to work in boss, worker relationships. I want to work in team relationships. I really was glad that I wrote In Prison and Communities by myself. I needed to do that for me. But really everything that I've done that matters, I've done with someone, and the with has been, and for the most part, it's been students. Not always, and it's been collaborative.
Right.
As you know,
Right.
one of the problems of working with me in a collaborative relationship is sometimes people assume it's all me, and people who work with me know it ain't. Really.
Well, I mean, I do think that you live that too. I remember when I first met you, I must have been like 24 or 25 years old. You invited me to be the managing editor of CPP, but you treated me like co-editor from the beginning. Even when ASC wouldn't let me officially be co-editor, you treated me as co-editor. I was in every board meeting. So, and in fact, all of our editorial board members treated me that way too, from very early on. I think it was the modeling of, she has an important voice in this room. She's going to do a lot of the work, as we bring this journal.
Well, and the truth is, it wouldn't have happened without the kind of time and attention. I'm not capable of that kind of time and attention.
Right.
So, and I don't. So it's funny because I think, on the one hand, I don't feel any particular need to have sole ownership of anything.
In the laboratory frame, the person who owns the lab gets his name first on everything, or her name first on everything all the time. That's not how I feel about things. When Dina and I wrote the piece that came out in Criminology, I thought that was my idea to begin with, and so I should be first author, and we had this debate, and I said, let's count paragraphs. And I should never have said that. Because, we count paragraphs. She had more paragraphs in it. I thought, oh shit. So she was first author. So I think, I believe in that kind of shared relationship thing. But I have, and again, I'm telling you, but you know this better than anybody, I have tremendous weaknesses as a scholar. And I feel grateful that the things that I don't do well, I have a teammate who does well. And,
Right.
So
yeah.
Whenever I think about, because you have really big ideas, right? But you don't often have the patience to write it all down.
Well, and to say, this is the history of this idea.
And I think that's where we worked well together. And I'm so detail oriented and such a detail person. You're such a, big idea person, but not really. Usually moving on to the next thing, not necessarily leaving the other thing behind, but you're on to the next thought, and therefore, we worked well in that way, and that's probably what made us more of a team. But you have had other students as well who have benefited immensely from your mentorship. So I wondered if you could name some of your other students who are now, Braga, for example, is a student.
So I'm particularly, Braga was a student of mine, although he was mainly supervised by David Weisberg. I'm particularly proud of a couple of students who are quite different in their careers. One is Harry Dammer.
Harry is now an assistant dean at the University of Scranton, has headed up criminal justice programs at Niagara and Scranton. But I'm proud of Harry because
Harry is comes out of a very working class family that would not have said, son, you should go get a PhD to him, and he has an extraordinary work ethic, and the thing about Harry is that he takes advice. So if you say, I don't think that's a good idea, he goes, okay. And he's done tremendous stuff on his own. Been a Fulbright scholar twice, has a couple of books in multiple editions, stuff like that. Another person who, again, these were people whose primary mentors were other people for their dissertations, but I sort of feel, this sort of, is Nancy Levine, who's, she's the evidence-based person of the century kind of thing.
Right.
And I'm sure she and I would, while I have tremendous admiration for what she's done at Urban, she and I would disagree about a dozen issues about criminology. But she has taken this idea that this is a field that is relevant to practice and just made it work. Another is Faye Taxman, who again did her dissertation under somebody else, but has been somebody I care about. And Jim Burr, I'm now missing all these students. They're going to watch this tape and they're going to go, hey Todd, what about me? But we were at the corrections breakfast this morning, and I think there must have been 10 or 12 students I worked with closely there, and I think every one of them would have whatever to say about me, this or that or the other thing. But what's true about them is that they let me be me in relation to their work. And they didn't need a different kind of person than I was. I don't know if they needed me, but I was able to be me in relation to them. Another one is Lee Ross, who he didn't have any kind of criminal justice history in his academic history in his background, parents or anything. And after he defended his dissertation, he came to me and he said, so now show me how to do a dissertation. I said, no, you show me how to do a dissertation. And he, like the bells went off, he said, oh, okay. And he went off and did it. And another woman from Florida State, Melvina Sumter, whose family were sharecroppers, and now she's a professor at Old Dominion. These are people who had such a desire to become scholars, and all I did was sort of hitch my train onto their desire. I've had a couple of students who didn't want to work very hard, and those relationships don't go very well.
Right. Yeah, you definitely appreciate hard work out of people, that's for sure. I also wanted to ask, so if you were to give advice to the next generation of corrections scholars or criminological scholars even more broadly, what pieces of advice would you give?
Wow. So I have loved not being PC. I hate to say it.
Your nickname has been PCTC for a long time because of how non-PC you can be.
It's a little embarrassing because when I was at Provost, we had a jar. And when I had a meeting and I would use the F word in a meeting, I had to put $20 in the jar. And I sometimes would just say, all right, I'd just pull out 2 20s and throw in the jar so I could just go forward. I don't think I don't advise it, I don't think it's a good thing, it's not a particularly proudful thing, but it's just the truth about me. I'm rude. I think one of the pieces of advice is that there's a tendency in this field to be cookie cutter. In your research strategy, or in the idea, or in the application, and push against that. The cookie cutter nature of academia and criminology is stifling, and so for me, I don't know if it's true for everybody. For me, not being cookie cutter has been a secret of enjoying this. The second thing is, and this is probably not 100% good idea, but I don't think you should say no very often. When a person comes in and says, you want to work on this, you should almost always say yes, unless you don't agree with it ethically, because you have no idea what you're going to learn. You have no idea where it's going to go, and so you get a little less sleep, or so watch Saturday Night Live. I mean, no, right, fair, but when I was growing up as a young professor, before tenure and then after my associate professor, I had always had 7 or 8, 9 projects going on at once, and I always felt a little overwhelmed. But 4 out of 5 of them produced things that I had no idea what the next step was going to be, and that they all introduced me to new people, and they created this network of scholarly relationships, and we joke, I can't walk through the ASC without getting stopped 8 times or 9 times, and it's kind of a funny thing. But on the other hand, I think it's a sign of how many different people I've had even small relationships to the work they were doing or work we were doing together or something like that. And I think it's really easy to be critical. It's very difficult to be critical well.
Right, and what's funny about that is I'm constantly told that I need to learn to say no. So next time someone tells me that, I'm going to say, my mentor told me you never say no to anything. The other funny thing about that, there's a few things, lots of things I remember about working with you, but one of my, now that I'm in academic administration as well, and you were for quite a long time of your career as well, I remember you said very early on when we were working together in the doctoral program, that you felt like there should be a form to say no, right?
Right.
The reason people don't want to do things is because saying yes means doing work,
Right.
and saying no means you don't have to do anything. Right?
Right.
And so I remember you wanted to invent a form that if you wanted to say no to this idea, you were going to have to fill out a big long form.
It would take you longer to say no than to say yes.
Exactly,
Right.
and you said that would incentivize doing, being innovative and doing new things and not doing.
You want to serve on this committee? No. Okay, then fill out this form. Oh shit. Okay, I'll serve on that committee. Okay, good. I'll take
I'll take my
back.
form back. And so you definitely live those values. And the other value I think that everyone should probably know about you. There's two things that I thought of during the course of this discussion so far. One is that you are one of the most loyal people. And I think loyalty probably comes from your background and your family and your sort of theological background, but loyalty is definitely one of your strongest qualities.
That's
and
nice.
a quality that you also look for in others, I think, as well. And a quote that I distinctly remember, probably from class, when I first had a class with you, was that you said, and I think you've always planted this seed in my mind, and I think your own as well. We were talking about something in the class, and you said, you don't have to scratch very deeply to find the punitive person in me, right? And you've written all these books about penal harm, but you were making the point that, it's very easy to have that visceral reaction, and that it actually lives in all of us. It's just learning how to, that's not necessarily the right way to go. And so that's something you said that I distinctly remember, that, I remember every time I'm behind the wheel driving in Massachusetts, because I think of that a lot. Like, you really don't have and so fighting that is a battle that I think people in corrections, fight regularly, because there is that punitive streak, I think, in a lot of people.
Yeah, I think, this may
May not be true of everybody, but I know it's true for me, that it is this capacity I have for really being harmful. I know I have it. I can be vengeful. Well, if you cut me off in traffic, I don't want you to just be, disciplined. I want you to be shot in the side of the head after having been whipped. So, but I know that that's not the me I want to be. So I know I'm capable of a different feeling. But the fact that I'm capable of that feeling makes me understand somebody who really, really, really is angry about all that stuff. And I haven't been the victim of a serious, terrible crime, so I don't know what my feelings would be if that happened to me. But I do know that I'm capable of some pretty distorted thinking about the way people ought to be treated. So managing that in me is the first step in trying to understand how you would manage that in a society.
Right. And I think I want to sort of make one of my final questions be related to around where do you think we should be going from here? Right. So in corrections, in criminology, what are the burning questions that you no longer have the energy to answer, but that you wish you did, or that you hope that the future generation picks up and runs with, if there's a direction you think we should be going?
So we still have to come to grips with issues of race, and I think the conversation is getting better. It's also, at the same time, getting more stereotyped. So it's getting more rote. And I think some of the roteness of the conversation about race has to disappear, and some of the rawness has to resurface. And I don't know that it can happen. It'll be painful if it does. But we had an African-American president, born in Kenya, I understand. Yes, I said that. And I think it made us all sort of relax a little bit. Hey, we got this thing covered, But I just finishing a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. And what Grant did when he was president around the treatment of recently freed slaves in the South is shocking, not because of what happened then, but because the kinds of struggle that Ulysses S. Grant went to almost 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they're being reproduced right now about, how do you stop segmenting a whole set of people on the basis of their historical treatment apart from society and discard them. And and I think mass incarceration has really been the grandchild of slavery, and we have to talk about it. It's made more complicated by the fact that we have that there's a Latin American interest, people coming into the U.S. from Latin American countries and getting involved in the criminal justice system, muddy the water because their story is mostly different. Some of the experience they have is the exact same experience, but their story is mostly different. So when you talk about color, we often act as though that's the same thing, but it's really not. There are dynamics that are the same, but race is at the center of the historical scar of our country, and we have to keep having that conversation, but we have to get better at it. We have to stop doing it sort of in a lockstep or stereotype, but we have to really engage that. It's very, very difficult. I work at Rutgers University in Newark. Newark is an African-American town. It has a long history of black political leadership and black cultural activity. And it wasn't, I've been there since almost 30 years. It wasn't really until 2 years ago or 3 years ago that I understood, crap, I'm white in this black town. That place is structures around what I can do, what I should do, and I can, and it's not my job to just throw my hands up and say, oh, I'm white. It is my job to accept the truth of the fact that my whiteness changes how I can be relevant to a city like Newark. And I deeply want to be relevant to that city, but not on my terms. It can't be on my terms, right? It has to be on the real terms of the real world. Well, even as I say these words, I know we're not very good at getting them right. But that's the next, I think, for the field, the conversation about women in the criminal justice system is being led largely by women. The conversation about African Americans in the criminal justice system is being led largely by black scholars. Fair enough, but it has to not be that in the end. That has to be a stage in what is actually happening. I don't know how to go, and I think it's going to be very uncomfortable. I don't think it's going to be easy, and I think there will be lots of mistakes made. But if we stay where we are now, we will be talking in lingo rather than in real practice. And there are real human lives out there. There are children being born. There's damage being done to people and by people, and that has to be engaged in a meaningful way. And I think it's going to be mistakes will be made in doing that, but the bigger mistake would be to not do it.
Right. So I wanted to also, relatedly, and I think this is an important point, related point to what you're saying. Today, Todd, you received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Division of Corrections and Sentencing, and in the room was one of my African-American students, Carlos Montero, and he looked around and said, "This is the whitest room I've ever seen." Right there was literally, he may have been, there was maybe one other African-American person in the room, literally, in a room of almost 200 people who study corrections and sentencing, and I think it just suggests we have a very long way to go, right, at that room.
Yeah, and I think what worries me a little bit right now is that
because there is such readiness to talk about it, but in sort of prepackaged ways,
right,
we're going to miss an opportunity to really engage in it.
To do, really.
I'm impressed. I spent a month in Australia over the summer. They have similar kinds of issues with Aboriginal peoples there and Torres Strait Islanders. I don't fully understand that. I absolutely admit that their issues are more their own, complicated in ways than ours. But they're pushing themselves up against those issues in a way that we should admire. They're surfacing the conversation. My sabbatical in 2007 was in South Africa. The conversation there surfaces in a way that it's not surfacing here, and I don't know, and we may not be able to do it. It just may not be possible for us. But I think until we are engaging the problems of structural disadvantage with honest talk, we're going to have a lot of trouble reforming the criminal justice system meaningfully.
And then one last anecdote that I just want to get on the record, on the tape. It wasn't only a few years ago, and I cannot remember, so I can't give credit where credit is due to who showed me this, but I remember snapping a picture of it and sending it to you. Sort of testimony to your impact on not only people who work in corrections, but people who live in correctional facilities. Someone was doing an inside-out type of class with incarcerated people and college students, and they were doing a word cloud, I guess, of what do you think about when you think about it, and I believe it was community justice. And there were words like family, individuals, prisoners, Todd Clear. The only name among a sea of words that were otherwise, very obvious things people come up with. And that your name comes up, and when people think on both the inside and the outside about corrections, I think speaks volumes on your impact on the field. So I wanted to ask, as a final question, if there's anything you wish I had asked as we get this on the record for the second time around, is there anything you wish I asked that I didn't? Any last words you want to say to the field or to the scholars coming up?
So I'm operating under the assumption that literally nobody is going to see this
interview. That's probably the safest assumption. I don't feel like I have any hugely sage advice. All I can say is in my early 20s, 21 years old, more roughly speaking, 21, 22, I discovered punishment in this weird way by sleeping in my senior year in college. And what a gift to be given a career's worth of deeply engaged and meaningful work. And so my advice is weird. It's like if it doesn't engage you, don't do it. It's easy for this work to be sterile and push button. If you don't wake up thinking about the meaning of it, then don't do it. Do something else. And then I think the other thing is there are the people who are involved in the criminal justice system. I used to think they were mostly probation officers and police officers and so on. That's where I started. And then I started thinking about all the people they are arresting and putting in prison and putting on probation. And then more recently I started thinking about all their children and spouses and parents. And once you do that, it's all of us. We all are engaged in the criminal justice system as citizens and as consumers and as producers. And so this is about making our lives better, more meaningful, not just about some other person or some other thing or some future. This is about being relevant to the stuff we're engaged in and the world we're responsible for. And it's a real privilege to be able to do that work and to get paid for it.
Right. Well, let me say thank you for sharing your career, a little bit about your life with us, and for taking this time to do this interview. We appreciate all your sage wisdom. Even if you didn't think you were giving it, people are going to receive it as sage wisdom. And so I wanted to say thank you again for doing this. And then in a piece that you can cut, today I did give you the DCS Lifetime Achievement Award. I know you probably wish that Dina could have heard it.
I do.
And so I thought I would just read the record. So the Lifetime Achievement Award in the Division of Corrections and Sentencing honors an individual's distinguished scholarship in the area of corrections and or sentencing over a lifetime. Recipients must have 20 or more years of experience contributing to the scholarly research. And as I commented, most people wouldn't believe you had that 20 years, but you do. So you do qualify. And Dr. Todd Clear has spent his entire career working tirelessly to improve the practice of corrections. From his early work on the practice of probation, to his pioneering research on community justice, to his ongoing work advocating for reducing the harm that mass incarceration has imposed on individuals, families, and communities, both directly and indirectly affected by it, Todd has shown a sustained commitment to the practice. Todd's doctoral dissertation, The Specification of Behavioral Objectives in Probation Supervision, was focused squarely on improving the practice of probation. Todd spent many, many months immersing himself in the world of the probation officer. His passion for on-the-ground research that makes a difference in the lives of those who work in corrections and those who are under correctional control has never waned. Todd is the antithesis of an ivory tower scholar. Through all of his work, he engages and involves the people most affected by the correctional policies and practices, as well as those practitioners charged with developing and implementing those policies. As demonstrated by any quick review of his CV, his contributions to the field of corrections range from small to substantial, but notably span his entire career as a scholar in the field. Todd has written some of the most influential books in the area of corrections, from his groundbreaking book Harm in American Penology to his more recent books Imprisoning Communities and The Punishment Imperative. Todd's work has consistently challenged the notion that incarceration works as a crime prevention strategy. Together with Dina Rose, he drew upon the classic work of contemporary social disorganization theorists to develop the coercive mobility thesis, explaining how incarceration would likely increase crime in the disadvantaged neighborhoods where incarceration concentrates. While currently a distinguished professor at Rutgers University, Todd was formerly provost of Rutgers Newark, dean of the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers, a distinguished professor and executive officer of the doctoral program at John Jay College, and an associate dean at Florida State University. There are a few scholars that are as well known in the field as Todd, and his work has influenced the work of so many others. As one of his many former students, I can also attest to his outstanding mentorship. His work to always inspire and cultivate the next generation of scholars will surely mean that his impact on corrections will only grow. It was with pleasure that I presented you today with the Lifetime Achievement Award.
And I gotta say, when you read that thing, I thought, wow, I like myself.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.